Yeah.
So in the chronology of modern bass players,
Oh, okay. Uh, well, Jimmy Blanton, as far as soloists are concerned, I think Jimmy Blanton was the first major soloist. There were some eminent rhythm players before him. The first one I've ever heard in person, who I know was there when it happened, was Ed Garland. I got to hear him when he was 92 in Stockholm, and he had been born in 1885. Started playing in 1894 when he was 9, and by the turn of the century, he was playing with Buddy Bolden and the inventors of jazz. So, as far as I know, Ed Garland was the first jazz bass player. As long as we start with him, okay? I got to, I start. It won't take that long because I don't know enough about it to take a long time. But I asked him a million questions the night that I met him in Stockholm, and among others, I said, "Did you know Wellman Bro and Pops Foster?" And he said, "No, hell, I taught those guys." He said, "Sometimes Wellman sound just like me," and okay, so he was, as far as I know, the first jazz bass player. I would welcome a correction if somebody knows of somebody who came before 1894.
and where was he?
He
Where
was
was
in
he
New
born?
Orleans. He was born in New Orleans, and he made the same trip Jazz made, up to Chicago, then to New York, then to, I believe, Kansas City, and out to Los Angeles. I don't know the exact chronology, but I think and then, yeah, when I met him, he was 92. 4 years later, he died in London of the flu, 96. Uh, then we had, Pops Foster and Wellman Bro. Wellman Bro lived a long life too. He wound up recording for Contemporary in California on the other West Coast jazz company there with Kid Ory and the Dixieland bands that Contemporary was recording. They called it Good Time Jazz, their other label. Um, and then, as I say, as far as playing rhythm in the big band, Walter Page kind of laid it down with Count Basie, as far as I was concerned, and Jimmy Blanton with Duke Ellington. His playing is still definitive for most of us jazz bass players. There are some young guys in New York now, again, trying to sound like Jimmy Blanton or Oscar Pettiford. There's a young guy named Christian McBride who's coming up. He needs a new fingerboard, but aside from that, he's doing very well. He's trying to sound like these guys. No amplifier.
Mm-hmm. That's like Ben Wolf and Harry Connick's band, Harry Connick Jr.
Yes, exactly right. And Harry Connick, I think, is doing a great service, if only by introducing Ben Wolf and saying one of the greatest bass players in the world. He can lay down a beat like nobody else. Lay down a beat, Ben, and having him, play a little. We caught them here at the amphitheater. Just parenthetically on that subject, I think Harry Connick Jr. is riding the crest of an enormous wave of interest in the standard songs. We have now reached the time where the standard songs have passed the test of time. We know they're going to be around as long as Mozart and Bach and Beethoven, and standard now means classical. The words are actually similar anyway. Mm-hmm. Standard now means classical, and Harry Connick doesn't have to be great as a singer or as a piano player. What he's doing is great. He's riding the crest of this wave of interest, and now Natalie Cole is doing exactly the same thing, much better, and she's got the most expensive arrangers and musicians in the world doing it with her. Of course, it comes out better. And to that teaming of her with her dad, it was spooky. Pardon the expression. It was great. I thought it was great. We have that here, and we listen to it.
Just an aside. Rob, my fiance, Rob Thomas, who's a bass player and jazz violinist, first taught Ben Wolf bass in Eugene, Oregon.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, he can be proud of that.
Yeah.
Ben sounded great with the band. It was a good big band,
Then did you hear he left Harry Connick's band?
No.
To go tour with Wynton Marsalis.
Oh, well, good for him.
Yeah.
Great. That's good news. Did you hear that, love? Ben Wolf, the bass player we heard with Harry Connick Jr., left Harry Connick Jr. to go play with Wynton Marsalis. That shows good taste on the part of Wynton Marsalis, I think. Up until now, I've heard... Well, I think it speaks well for Wynton Marsalis, too, because up until now I've heard quotes from him that sounded right on the edge of racist. Mm-hmm. I hope they aren't correct. I hope he didn't say what people say he said. He plays his buns off, of course. He's a great trumpet player. Yeah. And he is going back in time. He's going back to our forefathers, you know, and listening foremothers or whatever, and listening to what came first. I didn't want to sound like a sexist there.
So now we're at Jimmy Blanton.
Yeah. Yeah, Jimmy Blanton really was one of a few, probably the most prominent, who really made the bass into a great solo instrument. Coincidentally, or I should say chronologically parallel with him, there is a bass player who's still alive, who was Danish and is Danish, now living in Switzerland, named Niels Foss, Nielsfoss, who gave me a recording that he made in 1938 with a piano player. And I'll put that up against Jimmy Blanton anytime. He had never heard Jimmy Blanton. He was the first that I know of the Danish demons, the Damon Danishes. The Danish demons. It's still early, I'm sorry. He was, Niels Foss played in tune. He swung like hell. He got a beautiful sound out of the bass. And technically, he was all over the place. He was doing what I call skippity booms, upside down. Then he'd go, you know, you know, 1938, and in tune and pretty sound, and in time, swinging like hell. So more people should know about him. And we have Bob Haggart, you know, who goes back. Bob Haggart, as far as I know, wrote the first really good bass book. That was the bass book that I started with in '47. It was already old then, I think. And Bob Haggart also played probably the most requested bass solo of all time, Big Noise from Winnetka. But it's a mistake to think in Crow Jim terms. It's a big, bad mistake. Maybe we can take just a minute on that. As far as the development of the bass, now we're talking about, you know.
Well, in styles and where you come in jazz history.
Yeah, I guess just chronologically, my thing started with this. I had already tried to play the alto and clarinet, and along came Bird. Okay? Now, I didn't want to be caught in the same building with an alto case in my hand with that guy, let alone on the same bandstand with the horn, or even with another horn on the same stand with Dizzy. No way. I didn't have that much talent, and I knew that then. And at the same time, I heard these other bass players who were working with Bird and Dizzy, like Tommy Potter, and I loved Oscar Pettiford. As Dizzy will tell you to this day, there was nothing wrong with Oscar Pettiford. However, capital H, style-wise, Oscar and Slam Stewart were about a generation behind Dizzy and Bird. And I thought that the only in for me would be maybe to play underneath these guys, not alongside of them, but as an accompanist, underneath them, and in the same generation with them. Understand the harmonies, which I had been working on all through high school and a year at Cornell, I did that instead of doing my homework at Cornell and in high school too. Excuse me. As far as that's concerned, I was trying to figure out how to play bebop on the piano, work out the harmonies and the rhythms and so on. And I thought that would give me a head start as a bass player. I'd be able to come into the jazz world as a bass player speaking bebop. And when I heard Ray Brown do it in 1946, then I knew it could be done. Although there was something that I thought I might have that Ray Brown didn't have. And I thought, well, yeah, I'm going to have my own voice. It isn't going to be like Ray, but Ray showed me that it could be done. And
that's great. So, in developing your voice, you have obviously. I mean, anybody that knows jazz can put on, any album where you, whoever you've recorded with, can put a record on and go, that's Red Mitchell.
Well, thank you, Tricia. That wasn't easy. That wasn't easy. And as a matter of fact, just recently, we'll get back to the chronology in a minute, okay?
Sorry,
just recently, there are two discographers now, one named Phil Schaap in New York, who's trying to do the definitive discography on Billie Holiday. And he wants to get it right. He wants to be sure he has the right information on who was on each track that she ever did in her whole life. And because of my being on some of these, and because of Norman Granz not having taken the care to sort that out as he recorded us, he didn't write it down right. They got it wrong on the record covers, and so he's been trying to sort out who was on which tracks of these recordings that I did. And there was, in fact, one session where Joe Mondragon subbed for me, and he's on some of the takes, and his name appeared on takes that I was on, and my name appeared on takes that he was on, and then there were some takes that don't list any bass player at all that we can pin on Norman Granz. He really didn't care that much. I suppose I'm not going to say why, but it was the fish stinks from the head or something. It had to be his fault somewhere along the line. So I was forced to listen to all of these things and sort out who was me and who was Joe. And it wasn't that easy, let me tell you. Because I kept thinking, well, now, wait a minute, that's me, but I don't want to take all the credit from Joe. He was there. And we did sound a lot alike at the time. Johnny Mandel used to hire us. We were his two bass players. Whenever he'd do a picture, he'd start with us, and then if he had four more, so much the better. But if he only had two, it would be Joe Mondragon and myself. So the reason was that we heard pitch and time the same, and we even got our sounds were even very, very similar. So this was the middle 50s now. And the fact that I had a little bit of trouble, it turned out to be the choice of notes, the melodic lines that sorted us out. And Larry Bunker said the same thing, and Jimmy Roll said the same thing. And so did Alvin Stoller. In fact, you could tell by the lines who was who, and that's what wound up sorting it out. But the fact that it was a problem is interesting to me now, because I was trying to get it right then. What Joe thought was right was apparently what I thought was right too. And then 10 years later, or 12 years later, 68 when I left the country, and I had actually adjusted to those demands. I had practiced for years so that the VU meter would go over to the same place for every note, so one note wouldn't stick out, and try to play in tune and swing and play in time and get the right notes and play melodies and do all that you're supposed to do. And I'd gotten very busy in the studio scene because of that, because I was easy to record and I was flexible and I could play more or less any kind of music, even 10 years with the electric bass and so on. In 68, when I left the country, I made myself about 6 heavy promises, and one of them was, no more Mr. Nice Guy. I'm never, ever again in my life going to play 2 notes the same. They're all going to be different. And some of them are going to have words on them. And I've been working on that since. And because of the intense interest in jazz in Sweden in 1968, I was able to to concentrate on that. They allowed me to be myself and to grow deeper in place instead of going all over the lot and doing every other kind of music in the world. So the 24 years in Sweden was really a growth experience for me. I'm very thankful that there was a Sweden where they loved jazz in 1968 and still do, of course, and where I was allowed to flourish instead of become another studio sausage, you know. Chronology first. It isn't all that complicated. There aren't that many style setters, I don't think. As I say, my beginning was, okay, I love these melodies. I learned the tunes, you know, Shaw Enough and Groove and High and all. I learned the melodies. And I thought there's no reason why the bass lines shouldn't be that hip. And at least be the bottoms of the right chords for those tunes. Later on, I got a compliment from Dizzy when I was working with him in '68. He said something about that I knew how to set up the tonality that he needed to play. And he taught me something in the way of giving me this compliment. He taught me something about bitonality. He said, if the rhythm section is supposed to be playing a C7th chord, I want it to sound like C7th. I don't want a whole lot of funny high notes up there in the bass that make it sound like something else. I want to hear the C while I'm playing. Even if I'm up in the high register and blasting, I want to hear the C and the C7. And then, if I want to, I can play bugle calls in D and sound hip like a motherfucker. If I play bugle calls in D and the rhythm section isn't sounding like C, it's just going to sound corny. So he was complimenting me, and I said, well, that's actually very simple. And he said, well, simple isn't easy. And that gave me the idea for a tune, which I later wrote, called Simple Isn't Easy, title tune on the record.
Great.
Anyway, that's what I thought maybe I could do, and that's what I've been working on, to first and foremost be the background for these great players, the base, the foundation. The foundation of the house must be the same shape as the house and in the same place. It's not good if it's a lot bigger or somewhere else or smaller. The base is the foundation of the group musically. So, I mean, pitch-wise, we're lower than anybody else. So we have to be doing the same thing everybody else is doing from the get-go. Anyway, then the next major bassist I heard was Mingus in '48. My first love was his cousin, and so I heard about him before I met him. He was a philosopher, among other things, and he had written papers about his concept of the universe and philosophy about religions, and I saw some of that before I even met him. Then I heard him sit in up at Minton's in 1948, and he wiped me out. He sat in with Art Blakey. I'm sorry, it was Thelonious Monk's group, and Art Blakey was playing drums, and Al McKibben was playing bass. I meant to say before that I didn't get to do these Birth of the Cool recordings because I was out of town all 3 times they did them with different bands.
Oh, you were asked, but you didn't.
I was asked. I made the rehearsals, but then when it came time for the recordings, I was out of town first.
That's a good tidbit because I may have given you credit for.
Yeah, I wasn't on the recordings. The first one was I was out with Jackie Paris. Second one I was out with Charlie Ventura. The third one I was out with Woody Herman. And they used Al. That's what reminded me of it. Al McKibben was on the third one, I think. Joe Schulman was on the first one, and I think Nelson Boyd was on the second one. Just speaking of Al reminded me of that. Anyway, Al came over to the bar, and I was standing next to him talking to him when Mingus sat in with this group with Thelonious Monk, Idris Suleiman, and Sahib Shahab, and Art Blakey. And the way Mingus played that night, my jaw just dropped. I said, that is the great. I said, Al, you know I love you. He's about this tall, I had to look up and say, Al, you know I love you, man. But that is the most fantastic bass player I've ever heard in my life. He said, nope. And I said, who then? And he said, Oscar Pettiford. And I said, well, okay, back to square one. But Mingus did so. He went up to the end of the fingerboard, swinging, and played over to the southwest corner, which is virgin territory for most of us. The southwest, as you look at the bass, the southwest corner of the fingerboard is the high notes on the low strings. And that's unexplored territory for most of us. He went right up there and played melodies right across and back down and wiped me out. By coincidence, Charles and I won the Critics' New Star Award. We tied for first place in 1953. And he went his way and I went my way. We went different ways.
What was that award again? What was it called?
Then it was called New Star. Now it's called Talent Deserving Wider Recognition.
Yeah.
It was the critics' poll.
The critics' poll. That's like in a downbeat.
Yes, it was in downbeat. And neither of us either got a plaque or anything, but we scored evens for some reason. We both tied for first place in 53. But Mingus then became more of a communicator than a bass player. I mean, he was always a great bass player from the get-go, but he went into communicating with the critics, for example. I use him as an example when I give my seminar on communication. He had his way of communicating with the critics.
Do you mean just verbally or musically?
Both. And it was a two-way communication. I'd like to check this out with Leonard Feather sometime. I never had, but I heard the story from Jimmy Rainey when he was working with Charles on Stan Getz's band. Jimmy said that Charles told him that he had said to Leonard Feather, who was, I think, either the editor, he was very big at Downbeat at that time anyway. Mingus had said, unless I get 5 stars for 5-star reviews for all my records and a lot of space in Downbeat for my opinions, I'll kill you. And he meant it. And Leonard Feather knew he meant it. And so he got it. He got a lot of space for his opinions, and he got all 5-star reviews. But the other side of that was that he took the critics' suggestions. They were talking about opaque sheets of sound and extended forms in jazz, and they had all these words. And he was serious about trying to figure out what they wanted to hear, and he did it.
I didn't know that. I mean, that completely changes my perception of Mingus.
Mm-hmm. He took on the integration of the world single-handed, and he was serious.
Really heavy.
Yeah. Well, I knew him real well. We had a 30-year bass club meeting, sporadically.
So now, did he would he confirm this by admission? I mean.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could ask Sue, his widow. One time, she told me that he'd had a birthday party, and they had a couple of guys there from Sweden, and she was taping everything at this birthday party, and he asked how I was doing in Sweden. And these Swedish guys exaggerated a little. They said I was doing really well. I was getting all the gigs and this and that and the other thing. And he was saying, see what you mean? This country, he had to go there to be appreciated. He said something like that. And then he said, Sue, come here. I want you to hear this. And she was somewhere else in the room. And he said, Sue, hey, America, come over here. Now, I heard this on the tape. Hey, America, come over here. Did you ever hear of it, Oh, I'm sorry. I'm mixing up two things now. They got to talking. That was on the tape, talking about he had to go to Sweden to be appreciated. The other thing was they got to talking about Jabbo Smith. That's what it was. Jabbo Smith, a New Orleans trumpet player who almost played like Lester on the trumpet, and he asked these Swedish guys if they knew who Jabbo Smith was, and they said, of course, we got all his records, and in fact later I got to hear Jabbo Smith in Sweden. But he said, people around here don't know who Jabbo Smith. That's when he called Sue. He said, hey, America, come over here. You know who Jabbo Smith is? And she didn't. You know, he said, see what I mean? You know. So he was really trying to pull the whole world together, all colors and all nations. And I didn't agree with his methods in all cases, you know. I couldn't and wouldn't have used the same methods, but that was his motivation, and I think I have the same motivation.
Now you think you have the same.
Oh, I always have, I think, yeah. I think that by the jazz world pulling me in, I realized that jazz could do that. It could bring different people together with love, and then later I found it always had. That was the idea in New Orleans in the beginning, when jazz was the accompaniment to the real integration, which was going on in the bordellos, of course, long before it became a political movement, and the funeral marches, and you know, from conception to burial, and all the parties in between, jazz was there as the accompaniment. And it's still doing the same. I think there's more of a market, there's more of a potential market for jazz now than there ever has been before. We see all these ethnic groups all over the world all saying me first, or us first. They all think they represent the human race. And the other species are to be killed off at any cost. You know, they all think... I have a little theory about that, which is that... our deepest instinct is for the survival of the species, not the individual. And that Mother Nature gave us this urge. She never gave us the information about who was in the species and who was out of it. Or she never told us how big the species was going to be, how other members of the species would look or something. That's up to us to figure out.
So then you would say the species is the human race.
The human race,
not
yeah.
The black African-American race, or
No.
the white human race, the species,
No.
the human
Yeah,
species.
yeah. I think any qualified anthropologist will tell you that there is only one species within the species. There is only one race within the human race. There are ethnic groups, there are gene pools, there are physical differences, all of which happened in the last 2 seconds, chronologically, in the history of the human race, the last couple of 100,000 years, maximum, out of millions, or, well, we don't know how many millions, but at least 1.4, I think. Anyway, for example, the change of skin color from Central Africa to Europe probably happened within the last 200,000 years, give or take 60,000 years. This is according to a new theory that came out. It was a cover story on Newsweek, I think. They had finally found Eve by tracing a certain gene backwards, which only is passed to female children. They figured out that every human being on the face of the earth today is genetically related to one woman, among others, who lived not more than 200,000 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the concept of different races within the race is what we call racism. That's what it is. The belief that there are different races within the race is racism, or the promulgation of that belief.
Well, this may be a bit trite, but that would explain why I heal in keloid. Like, if I'm scarred, if I get a deep cut, I heal in a keloid scar.
What's that?
Which is a very, it's a scar, rather than a scar healing up and becoming just very tiny and almost not noticeable, there's a lot of tissue, and it might raise on the surface as opposed to truly healing. And my stepfather, who was a physician, said keloid is the way African American, is the way black people heal.
I'll be damned. So by definition, by the American definition, you're black. Because there we go. Now here's where the ism comes in. Right. In other words, there must be somebody in your family who's what we call African American. Is that right?
Somewhere. Well, and if you said we traced the gene all the way to Eve.
Yeah.
And and Eve was.
Well, I write that kind of stuff into songs. I love to play with that stuff.
Inspiration of songs.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Back to you, Red.
Okay. Yeah.
That's great.
Well, I have a song called "What I Am," and it was the result of an interview I did with a very serious young journalist in Sweden, who interviewed me for about, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours with a tape recorder, and then finally turned it off, and then looked me dead in the eye and said, "Okay, now what are you? Not who are you or what do you do? What are you?" So I wrote this song called "What I Am," and one of the lines in it is, "Look up your roots, trace them all back. We all came from Africa, so we're all black." That's just the last line of one verse. Mm-hmm. So we have this rule in America that if you have any recent African genes in your family, you are black. But how come it isn't the other way around? If you have any recent white genes or European genes in your family, you're white. It only works one way. Why? Well, it's an ism. It's a belief system from which people think they're going to get all the answers, and there is no such thing.
You address isms in Corruptus Interruptus.
Yeah. Oh, you've listened to that. Okay, thank you. Yeah. I would like to quote Thad Jones on that one. He said, we got to talking about that one day, and he just shook his head and kind of stuck his lip out and said, "Yeah, ism ain't 'em."
Well, I want to get to that.
Yeah.
So you and Mingus were.
We came up at about the same time. He went his way, and I went mine, and I don't think there's any other bass player that sounds like Mingus today, but there are a lot of people who were influenced by his notions of freedom in jazz.
How would you articulate the distinction between, since you came up together, what distinguished you from Mingus?
Well, one thing was that he never really played bebop. He always picked with one finger, and he never played fast enough to do the bebop phrases. And his phrases were not bebop. They were mainstream jazz. He kind of did what, like a lot of other people did, he kind of hopped over, even though he worked with Bird and Dizzy once or twice, but I wouldn't call him a bebop bass player. He was a mainstream bass player who specialized in communication. And then his way of communication became an important part of the third stream, or whatever you call it, avant-garde, or the freedom movement. He was out after freedom. And his wife asked me to come and play at his service. He had set it up, as a matter of fact. He had it worked out. He knew he was going to die. He died slowly of Lou Gehrig's disease, as you probably knew. And he had it all figured out. And he had certain people chosen to play solos only, no groups. And I had to follow Sonny Rollins. He was first, and I was second. I wrote a poem to him and said that and played Body and Soul. Anyway, he and I were very close. And I think I understood what he was doing. As I said, we wouldn't have used the same methods. But right about that time, well, no, it wasn't. It was earlier, 1948, on this gig in Milwaukee with Jackie Paris. While the Birth of the Cool Band was recording, I was in Milwaukee figuring out this two-finger technique on the bass, because I knew I was too clumsy to play the phrases I wanted to play. I was kind of born stiff. And loose is an enormous advantage if you're a player. By the way, I'm amazed that there aren't more women jazz bass players, or jazz players in general, because loose joints are the key to swinging. And generally speaking, women's bodies are looser jointed than men's bodies, I think, for the purpose of having children, you know. I also have noticed that women are generally, okay, all generalizations are false, including this one, right? But generally, that women are looser, not only physiologically but psychologically too. And I think it's that flexibility that is the main reason that women, generally speaking, live longer than men. Adaptability.
So they're really loose.
Oh yeah.
To be loose women.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, we know that the adaptable species are the ones that survive. The ones that don't adapt don't survive. And I think within any one species, it's the same thing between genders. Anyway, then in the middle 50s, I was living in Los Angeles, and there were other bass players coming up, and I taught for a few years in there, and I had a couple of more or less proteges who I didn't teach formally, but Scott LaFaro and Gary Peacock were among them, and Charlie Hayden was a student of mine. He came every Saturday for 2 years, and I taught him whatever I could. He didn't want to learn the real rules. He wanted to go his own way. He didn't want to learn what I call the real rules. He wanted to learn his own version of the real rules and go his own way. And I think the only thing I taught Charlie in 2 years was to wait for his feelings, not just run off at the fingers. And I did succeed in teaching him that, and he does that today. He waits till his feelings come, till he gets an idea that he hears that he really wants to play.
So you taught Scott LaFaro. I didn't know that.
Well, I taught him the two-finger technique. And he, among other things, he used to come around whenever I was playing and ask a million questions, and I would hang out with him and try to answer them.
Now, my research that I've done so far is people have referred to Scott LaFaro as sort of that there's a Scott LaFaro school,
yeah,
which is one of a more conversational style.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, did you teach him the conversational style, or is this something he developed? Or
well, he developed this by himself, I think, but we talked about it, and he would ask me what the real rules are. Do you have to play 4/4, or why couldn't we do this? Why couldn't we put the strings down closer to the fingerboard and play faster? And as I say, I did teach him the two-finger. That's a matter of it's doing like this kind of, but a lot harder. It's a matter of independence of the hands, so that if you're going 2-1-2-1-2-1-2-1 with your right hand, and you're going 1-2-1-3-1-1-1-3-3-3 with your left hand, they don't tie up. Normally, they'll just tie up when you start to do that, but you have to develop that independence. And the style of playing, I mean, you can't teach somebody. I don't think I taught him to swing. I think there were a lot of times when he swung more than I did. But he and I talked bass every time we met, and then one time, I think the last time I saw him, he came back to Los Angeles with a bass that had been mine before that, and he had it rebuilt, and he wanted me to sit in and play on it because he was so happy with it. And he was working with Stan Getz. Stan Getz wanted me to sit in because he couldn't hear Scotty. And what Scotty had done was he had the strings put really low, close to the fingerboard. So they were so easy to play. They were so low that I couldn't find him, and he couldn't hear me either. But Scotty wouldn't use an amplifier. He was going for tone. He was, well, as we all are, married to the music, not the physics. And in person, the last couple of years, you couldn't hear him. You could see him, but you couldn't hear him. Hardly. I mean, he and Bill Evans managed to play. By the way, I think if anybody helped Scotty more than I did, I think it was Herb Geller. Scotty lived with Herb, and during that time he went from good to great. Herb filled him in on the changes in the tunes, and then took him to New York, in fact, to try to get him with Benny Goodman's band. And Scotty lasted about half a rehearsal with Benny Goodman. Benny Goodman just waved him out because he couldn't hear him. And one of those nights, Herb took him down to the Vanguard and introduced him to Bill Evans, and that's when that started. And Bill and Paul Modian had already worked out their version of that thing before they met Scotty. I heard them in '56. Hampton Hawes and I were working in Chicago in '56, and we heard them with Tony Scott, with a very good, normal 4/4 bass player. I've forgotten who it was. It was an African-American guy who I think well, I shouldn't name him because I probably named the wrong person. But Hamp's jaw just dropped, and so did mine, when we heard Bill and Paul Motian play together.
Paul Motian, M-O-T-I-A-N?
Yeah,
Paul,
yeah, M-O-T-I-A-N is an Armenian name.
The name that I'm thinking is Paul Motion. A lot of
Some people
call
pronounce
him,
it that way,
so
yeah.
we're talking about the same person.
Yes,
Okay.
right. In fact, I may be behind the times. I think Paul might have gone over to pronouncing it that way himself.
Motion.
Yeah. Anyway, he and Bill had already worked out that sporadic way of playing together that changed the whole rhythm section sound. You know.
Hmm. Well, now isn't what you're doing now as a soloist? I mean, a very conversational style. And
Oh yes.
Yeah.
It's all about conversations. Absolutely. If I've ever been, you know how I feel about isms and ists, but if I'm any kind of an ist, I think I've kind of become a duoist or trioist or something like that. Having worked since '77 at Bradley's with duos, and many years before that, going back to '55 in Los Angeles with Jimmy Rolls and Hampton Hawes. Hamp and I opened Dante's in '66 as a duo. We played 6 weeks there, and our job was to chase out the rednecks and draw in the jazz people.
My dad played Dante's a few times.
Did he?
He's a drummer. Yeah, he was there. He had his the Dick McGarvin group.
I'll be damned.
And he played with, I'm not sure who else played with him. Eric Marienthal, I think, played with him. These young guys, you know.
Yeah.
But, yeah, he was a drummer there. Played Carmelo's and Dante's.
I'll be damned.
Yeah. So
I may have run into him. I may have just run into him. The name sounds familiar. We, as I say, Hamp and I, they didn't have enough money for a trio at the beginning. We had to start as a duo. We had worked as a trio with Donald Bailey on drums at a place called Mitchell's almost a year before that. But at Dante's, they only had the money for a duo. So, as I say, it took us 6 weeks until they started drawing in enough jazz people to make money, you know, break even. Mm-hmm. And that was in '66. Anyway, as far as the evolution of the bass, I think what Scotty did really started something. It really did. I mean, there is what you can call a Scott LaFaro school. There are a lot of guys who were influenced by that. It was partly the fact that he got the job with Bill Evans and that it worked so well. And I think to this day that Bill always missed Scotty after his accident, you know. He had a lot of other players. There we go again. Now, Bill and I were close starting in 1948. We worked together with Mundell Lowe as a trio, and Bill and I were just both starting out then. Then I heard him again in '56, I say, with Tony Scott. And by that time, he had really developed this totally different style. And then I got to work with Bill a few times after that. There was one time when he did 4 nights at Shelley's Manhole, and we just played as a duo. There was another time when he called me to join him at the Vanguard in 1977, but I had just said yes to Jim Hall for the exact same day to start at Sweet Basil. And that turned out for Bill to be a bassathon. He was together with Philly Joe Jones at that time. And they went through a lot of bass players and wound up with Mark Johnson. Then in '78, I got to play with Bill for the last time. Somebody had the idea to put me with the trio as a soloist. I think it was probably Charlie Bourgeois, George Wean's idea, man. I'm not sure. But it was fine with Bill, and it was fine with me, and he had Philly Joe and Mark Johnson, and I just stood there and played as a soloist with the trio one set. It was a lot of fun.
It should have been an interesting sound.
It was, yeah. Leonard Feathers stood there with his jaw down.
Let's do some music.
Okay.
up for it?
Yeah. I'm sorry I don't have my microphone set up. If I'm going to